Welcome back to Take a Wander with Chevs, the ultimate travel podcast. On the show today, I am bringing back a guest that I've had on previously, Ash Bhardwaj, a travel journalist. We discussed his new book, Why We Travel, and this one was right up there as one of the best travel books I've read in probably over a decade. Ash goes into the science of why we travel, and to answer the question, why we travel, I really enjoyed the interview I did with him. It's fascinating. Hope you all enjoy it. Before we go into the discussion, here's how you can support the channel. You can support the channel by heading over to www.chebsthewonder.com. You'll be able to see the store tab, which you can hover over to and click. You can then buy various items from t-shirts, jumpers, hoodies, even water bottles and phone cases. If you have any questions, you can send me a message through the contact tab. Here's my discussion with Ash Bhardwaj about his book, Why We Travel. Enjoy. Ash, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you on again. You were with us a few years ago. How have you been since we last spoke?
I think since we last spoke, COVID happened. That was one big thing. I did a master's in strategic communications and propaganda at King's College London. That's learning about how to study and assess propaganda rather than becoming a propagandist. And wrote a book. So those are all the things that I've done in the last period of time. Went to New Zealand. That was a big trip. So all of those things basically have a relevance to the book, Why We Travel.
As you've come on before, for people listening, you can watch or listen to the show. There's a link on my description. You could watch it on the YouTube channel, or you can listen to it on the podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, whatever you listen to. And as I said, the book is Why We Travel, and it's a very interesting book. I've read a lot of travel books over the last decade or so, and a lot of them are very conventional, author story of why they've gone to a certain destination, what they've learnt maybe. But your book was very, very different. You did, of course, talk about some of your journey, but I feel as though it was very different to others because you've gone down a route of researching into why we actually travel. So scientific research, psychological research, why it is. And there's a few things that you spoke about in the book. So things like, well, in the chapters anyway. So curiosity, inspiration, happiness, mentorship, serendipity, hardship, service, empathy, healing, wonder, eroticism, which I was quite excited about to read initially because I thought, oh, Ash is going to be talking about his eroticness on his travel, but it wasn't quite that, and hope
Not
as
sex
well.
tourism, no. It's erotic in the way that Esther Perel used it, which is about the sense of aliveness between oneself and other, which is really, I think, what makes travel so exciting.
As I said, you've been on the show before. The first question I think I've always asked guests when they've come on, why did you fall in love with travel? And in this, initially, you talked about not being able to travel until you were 17 years old. And that was partly to do with, and you talk about it in the book, about you not having money as a family. When you first traveled yourself and you went to New Zealand, and also you talked about your mom having to get a second job to pay for the tour, and you went away for the first time. What was it for you? And you talk about it in the book. What was it that really got you curious about travel?
Yeah, thanks, Shiv. So the book is, as you say, different to normal travelogues. So a normal travelogue is the author has a reason to go on a trip, and then they basically write about that trip and what they learned from it. So it's a single destination, first person, a lot about the destination, and sometimes something about their personal journey and reflections as well. So it's very focused on the place and the person. I'd read loads of those books, and I found that I wanted more from my travel literature. Some of those are great. Some of those are, as I reference in the book, some of the authors that really inspired me and intrigued me in places that eventually became a big part of my life. But for when I wanted to write a book, I wanted to do something a bit more. I wanted to make a book that was useful to the reader so they could apply it, not just be inspired by it. And I also reflected on the types of books I like to read, which were philosophy books, bit of smart thinking, things like Sapiens or Prisms of Geography, those books that give you a bit more about the world. So that was my thinking that was layered into it. So it ended up being a mix of memoir, travelogue, a sort of research, science research, a bit of interview and reflection, and then advice. So about my analysis of the information that I'd taken away, but threaded through it with these journeys. And rather than doing a single journey, I ended up looking at 12 significant journeys throughout my life and how they'd change how I feel about travel. Because travel is sometimes delivered as a single topic, like you travel, but we all travel in very, very different ways. Like if I
Mm-hmm.
travel to Brighton to go on a stag do, that's very different to
Mm-hmm.
traveling to India on a Hindu pilgrimage to take my father's ashes there. I'm not Hindu, but my father's family are Hindu, so it's something I had to do. So travel is a many and varied thing. And I thought back to when did travel start for me? And as you mentioned, it was when I was 17. And we lived in social housing. Mum worked, um, mum was in income support. She worked as a cleaner and she got a second job as a cleaner in order to pay for me to go on a rugby tour with my local state school. So fell in love with travel because of New Zealand. But I fell in love with travel really because of New Zealand and my mum. She'd been to New Zealand in the 1970s. She loved it. And when she heard the school was doing this rugby tour to New Zealand, she said, I'm going to get this second job to pay for your ticket because I think this could really change the way you view the world.
That's an interesting thing that your mum said as well, because in the early stage you talk about,
Funny.
and then you talk about getting a scholarship and going to a boarding school to do your GCSEs, but you talked about being not a social bee, and it surprised me knowing you now.
I didn't feel, also everyone's slightly awkward when they're young, when they're a teenager, you're still trying to find your way. And mum just said, I think you will love this. And it did two things. First of all, it gave me a chance to build relationships with people in my new school and build bonds of friendship through shared hardship of doing rugby tour. But it also just revealed to me how interesting the world could be. The first motivation I talk about in the book is curiosity. And curiosity, I think, is the keystone of travel. Why is it like that? Why is this different? Otherwise, you just stay at home.
Mhm.
Why would you go on holiday unless it was different? So that's where that came from. So, and in the book, I go into the roots of curiosity, how it benefits us as humans, why it's important for learning, cultural evolution. Is there a genetic component to it? All those sorts of things. So what was funny is I started with the story of going to New Zealand and my mum started to think about curiosity as the motivation. And then ended up just going down the scientific path, which helped. Which my wife is a doctor,
Mhm.
and a scientist because she did the additional science degree whilst doing her masters, and I actually started doing chemistry and molecular physics as my degree before I switched to doing philosophy. So I had a decent amount of science in my background to be able to have the knowledge to start reading some of these papers and be able to make sense of them, and then bring that into how's this relevant to travel.
You talked about dopamine and it's linked to curiosity. So just explain what that is to someone who doesn't know what that means.
That's the question. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and your body releases it, or your brain releases it, when you do a task or an action that you get a benefit from. So the dopamine system is best known for when we eat fatty or sugary foods. We eat them, there's a dopamine release, and then it encourages us to eat more. Why does that exist? Well, back when we were hunter gatherers, we needed to get lots of calories in, and we could do that by eating berries, which are sugary, eating animals, which are fatty. So a link developed between the dopamine system and fatty and sugary foods, encourages us to eat them. Now we're not hunter gatherers anymore, but that's still with us. That's why when we eat fatty and sugary foods, we're like, oh, that was great. Let's do some more of that. It's linked to curiosity in a similar way. When curiosity occurs, and it's part of the learning process, basically. When you overcome a problem, you get a dopamine release, and that's kind of tied in with curiosity and learning and cultural evolution. I explain it a bit more in the book, but there you go.
To get curious, you and talk about the question to go back to the question of why we travel. So you have to get curious about travel. If you've never traveled before, and you said you traveled, the first time you went away was at 17, there might be people listening now that have never gone away anywhere, or well, they may have gone away on family holidays, but not necessarily travel on their own or travel with friends. And it's all linked in with your second chapter as well. You have to be inspired as well to travel. How do you get inspired to travel and be curious at the same time?
So two different things there. One is you have to have curiosity triggered for the curiosity dopamine system to start to work. In the same way that you're never going to get addicted to ice cream if you haven't eaten an ice cream. You have to eat ice cream for the first time for that to happen. And for me, the curiosity experience that triggered my curiosity dopamine system in relation to travel, and then it became a more conscious thing, was going to New Zealand. And inspiration is when someone else who's already been curious or has already done some exploration tells you that you might find something interesting by going to do it. So curiosity is the base layer, but sometimes you need someone to point you in that direction to say, go over there, you'll find something interesting. And, on the New Zealand one, that was my mum. And hobbies are also a good thing to use for inspiration. So it was a rugby tour that took me to New Zealand. It was rugby and skiing that took me back to New Zealand years later. Those things gave me a reason to go somewhere, and then I discovered everything else below it.
You mentioned skiing there, and skiing was something that you never done before, and so you go ahead and go and do skiing for the first time. Your curiosity comes about, and then you get inspired. And you also talked about you have to have some sort of aspiration as well to go skiing to an extent. So you have to be inspired by someone to then go ski, and then if you're curious enough to find out, actually, I want to do more of these sort of things.
In terms of how you apply that in your own travel, there's two ways to be curious. There's being curious before you go traveling. So that's, what am I curious about? What do I want to know? What questions do I want to answer? And then what places around the world will help me fulfill that? If you're interested in Crusader architecture, then you probably want to be going to the Mediterranean or the Levant. That's a place you're going to go to. If you're interested in the intersection of Buddhist and Muslim and Hindu culture, you probably want to be going to India and Southeast Asia. So if you have curiosity about an area, that's where that will take you. Then there's being curious once you are traveling. So that is, you've been curious about going somewhere, but then it's maintaining that curious mindset whilst you're in a place. That's asking questions when you're there, asking the right sorts of things. And it's the same with inspiration. So inspiration might send you to go to somewhere on the other side of the world, but then that place may start to inspire you in different ways. With the skiing, I went to university and people would ask questions like, where do you ski? Which was a really weird question to me because I was like, what do you mean, where do I ski? I don't even ski. That the cultural, social challenge of going to a university, which was with people who came from much more wealthier backgrounds than I did. But I would like to give skiing a go. And one of the guys in my hall's residence had a friend who owned a chalet or an apartment or a flat in a ski resort, and we went and stayed there and went skiing for the first time, and I loved it. And this goes into this section in the book on hedonism and eudaimonia. So this is happiness. It's either pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain, that's hedonism, or eudaimonia, which is a sense of purpose. Skiing is good because you have a sense of purpose because you're developing something, you're getting better at a skill, but it's also just very, very good fun.
What do you want people to gain from it for when they start picking up this book? In the past, when you travel, there was only guidebooks that you could relate to. Nowadays, you've got internet, all sorts of stuff, social media to guide us. But it's almost like a guidebook to why you should be what you should be thinking about when it comes to traveling. Is that the aim of the book?
It's a philosophical book, and it's a bit of a sort of guidebook to your own thinking. And going back to what I said earlier, travel is a huge domain that covers many different things, and we all travel at different times for different reasons. And this book came about because I was traveling less than ever. With COVID, my mum passing away, having a baby, doing a master's, I was traveling less. So I wanted each trip to be more purposeful. And I was like, well, how do I do that? So I wrote down all the big trips that I'd done, the 12 main trips that end up in the book. And then I thought about, well, I've got locations there. And then what type of trip was each of those? One was a sports tour. One was because I loved space and wanted to go to the place where the space program was developed. One was take my dad's ashes back. One was because I had a fascination with Japanese 1980s and 90s culture. So I had all these different reasons for going. And then I had types of trips within that. Each of them had a different motivation, some of which I didn't realize until afterwards. And I didn't go on that trip with that motivation. And I realized that if we just become more conscious about what we are looking for, then we can make our travel more fulfilling. Because travel marketing, the advertising we receive, focuses on happiness, hedonism, pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. And really, that's about it, actually. Some of them talk about the beauty of a place, which tips into wonder and awe, but none of them really talk about our deep motivations. Very few of them talk about curiosity, marketing material, this is, or inspiration, or mentorship, or serendipity, or the benefit of doing something really, really hard. So I just wanted to really point at those things and really draw them out and really dig into them a bit more. Because wherever you're traveling, even if you're traveling for hedonism, you can use all of these other motivations to make your time more fulfilling. You can go and sit on a beach. That's absolutely fine. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. But if you also go and use a bit of curiosity, go and open up a bit of serendipity, who knows what might happen, suddenly your trip becomes more enjoyable. And that was the idea of it, to liberate people, readers, from just the narrow constraints of what travel marketing throws at them.
And this is something that I didn't know about you before, and you've written about it in the book. So before becoming a full-time journalist or travel journalist, you had to work other jobs to get to that position. I suppose you have to work in different roles, different office jobs to get to, because you talk about longevity, you've got to think about the long term goal. Short-term goal, you have to work in offices or restaurants or bars or whatever to fulfill your dream as a journalist. But you said once you started getting recognized with your work, going away to places like walking the Nile with Levis Sport, that's when you started getting more recognition. But you're also saying it wasn't really necessarily paying the bills. You still had to do certain other jobs. I think that's very similar to today's society anyway. Is anyone a full-time travel journalist? That's the question. And you go into that quite in detail. So someone reading this book, they may think, I want to go into travel journalism or travel writing.
I don't actually think all travel journalists find it that fulfilling. I know plenty of people that earn money doing their jobs, whatever their jobs are. That might be an office job, and then they go off and enjoy their travel. And I think that's absolutely great. And if those people do want to just go and lie on the beach, that's also absolutely great. There's not like a hierarchy of travel. In chapter 3, I explore some research by Dr. Daisy Fan, which appears in a book called The Psychology of Travel by Dr. Andrew Stevenson. And she talks about the sort of scale of dependency. So on one end, you have dependents. These are people that will travel in groups and be completely dependent on a tour operator. They may not even speak to a local staying in a resort. And on the other end, you've got a belonging seeker. This is somebody that goes and lives somewhere for an extended period of time, probably lives with a local family, and probably works, learns the local language, becomes fully immersed. So you've got a scale of dependency difference within that. One's not better than the other. When I went on that rugby tour, I was definitely a dependent. And I slowly started to move my way up there. And then at different times in my life, I've gone back and forth. For life as a travel journalist, like travel journalism does not pay well. In my best year, I reckon travel journalism has given me maybe 20% of my income. But when I went on Walking the Nile, I was mostly there as a cameraman. So I was filming. I wrote some journalism as well about it, but I earned my money there being a DV director. Um, and yeah, like whenever you're starting out in any career, unless you come from inherited wealth or you have a family that lives in London and you can stay there for free, then you're going to have to do jobs that you don't want to do. And that's okay.
I've done quite a lot of press trips, very different to when you go away on your own. And you talk about this as well with your in your book, and there's different types of travel, as you just mentioned there. There's dependence. I didn't know this, by the way, until I read this. Dependent. There's conservatives. There's criticizers, there's explorers, and these are all sort of, and there's belonging seekers, and these are all different types of travelers.
Yeah.
If you're traveling for a press trip, for example, you're not necessarily going to be, I suppose you can be one of those, but you're there for work, aren't you? So it's a different type of travel. So the question go back to
Yeah.
why we travel. So why are we traveling? So you're traveling for work. So it's not necessarily any of those things.
What I have found, the great privilege of going somewhere as a travel journalist, is that it's not the privilege of a travel journalist, but it just gives you the confidence to access a place in a different way. You feel like you have the right to ask questions because you're there for a job. And people speak to you more readily and more easily. But what my wife has said is when we do ever go on holiday, which doesn't happen all the time, she loves it because I take that same mindset into travel, into holidays, which is why is this like that? Why is that like that? Yeah, so this was the point I was trying to reference. Within curiosity, how do you ask curious questions? There's questions of no importance, and then there's questions of some importance. So a question of some importance is how did the climate and landscape affect the cultures that evolved here? Why are the animals like this? What is the main music of this region and what were its influences? How did historical empires shape the language and religion? So you don't have to go there as a journalist, but those are curious approaches that you can take with you. What I found by being a travel journalist is I've developed and honed those questions. In chapter 11, which is about wonder, I suggest different ways of traveling, sorry, chapter 10. Uh, I developed these skills of traveling through being a travel journalist and researching stuff. But now I apply them in my everyday life. Processes like psychogeography or using sound as my texture and landscape of the city, or doing micro adventures, which Al Humphreys does so well. So it's about taking these things that I've learned, sharing them with people so they can apply them in their own travel. Because I've learned that through my own experience. I wish somebody had told me this stuff 20 years ago.
I'm going to go back to something that you mentioned about you said your dad as well, and there's a big chapter on it as well, where it's chapter 9, I think it is, and you talk about you had to go to India and put his ashes, and it's called Haridwar, because you go deep into this and you talk about you went to the doctors and you went to therapists, and it's quite a heavy chapter. Why was it so important for you to have that chapter in there?
So dad was Indian. He's Punjabi Indian, Hindu Punjabi Indian. He was not a practicing Hindu by any stretch of the imagination. And I was raised. He and my mum separated when I was very young, and I was raised by my mum. And he didn't really have a huge amount of input in my upbringing anyway. And my mum was English. So when he died, and being Hindu, he was then cremated, and he had to take the ashes back to this place called Haridwar, which is where the river Ganges comes out of the Himalayas in India. It was my job to go and take his ashes back there to put them in the river. And I couldn't be bothered really. I wasn't that interested in doing something for dad. So there's like a personal psychological journey of like getting ready to do that. And then there was the physical journey of actually going out to do it. And after I'd done it, someone referred to it as a pilgrimage. And as a non-religious person myself, I was kind of chafed at that idea. But I started to do some research into pilgrimage as a product of that, and like secular pilgrimage, and what is pilgrimage, what does it mean, and how many people do pilgrimage for a secular reason. And wrapped up in that is this idea called post-traumatic growth. We all experience different traumas in our lives. Some people experience awful traumas through conflict or violence. Others, like the other end of the scale, are sort of microaggressions. And going through the therapeutic process of counselling, going through therapy, overcoming some of my negative defensive behavioural patterns that are a product of my upbringing and experiences. So, like for kids, when you're like really little, environment has a huge impact on how you behave when you're older. And my dad was an alcoholic, and he was like, I guess he was fairly emotionally abusive. And there's no hierarchy of trauma really, but it's not the same as growing up in a physically violent or sexually violent household. So just putting that out there, it was emotionally abusive, and he was drunk. But that has an impact on you as a child growing up. So you develop defensive mechanisms, and through therapy, I kind of unpicked that and started to consider how those patterns that I developed back then were affecting me in my adult life, often in negative ways. So by going through that personal journey, it helped me. And it was my dad dying and then having to go and take his ashes back to India that helped trigger that process of beginning therapy.
Did you feel a sense of you weren't close to your dad? You mentioned that, and you said you didn't. There was you talked about in the book actually where you were playing snooker or pool or something, and you betted on
Mm.
your mum's wage, and you never trusted him ever after that. When he passed, did you a sense of? Did you feel at the time it's a sense of relief, or I missed out on having a father?
Well, I'm alive. The probability of a human being coming into existence is pretty low. And I was born in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Yes, we grew up in social housing, but I grew up in social housing in Windsor in the 1990s, late 1990s, under the Blair government. It's probably a good time to be growing up in social housing in a good place. Schools were well funded, all those sorts of things. So, don't really resent him. I'm alive. And I think it was probably through going through therapy and everything that I've been able to have that reflection. I think I did resent him for a very long time. I wasn't particularly sad that he died. He wasn't a particularly positive person in my life, but I am alive as a product of him. And I've got a wonderful Indian family as well. I've got lovely cousins and relatives and uncles and aunties and nieces and nephews. So there's all that that's great. And whilst he wasn't a great dad, he gave me life and he gave me access to lots of amazing things. That's what post traumatic growth is, right? So you can have this awful stuff, like like I say, what I went through is not the same as what people have gone through in much more traumatic situations. And it's not a case of every cloud has a silver lining. What post traumatic growth talks about is if a trauma has occurred, what are the things that if we then try and treat that trauma or deal with that trauma, psychological trauma, physical trauma, that can lead to outcomes that are greater than the sum of their original parts. And for me, I think that kind of tolerance and that kind of acceptance is for me my post traumatic growth, if you like.
That chapter and the chapter you wrote about your mother's passing as well. The question I want to ask you is, why is it relevant to the question of why we travel? Why do you think it was important to have those?
Because those were two of the most significant journeys in my life. And they were triggered by my dad dying and my mum dying. And you don't see that in travel marketing. But those will be the reasons why people travel so much, is not for the reasons of just going on a holiday. Because travel isn't just holidays. In the book, I talk about David Knott, who's a doctor, who's a surgeon, going to war zones in Syria and Sudan and Serbia to treat people who don't have medical care. I talk about soldiers going to places to provide security and going to places to help deliver aid. And I talk about going to places to do physically hard things because of what that does for you. A lot of these things are just not spoken about, but they're one of the reasons, or they are reasons why we travel so much. And for me, taking my dad's ashes to India and then beginning that therapeutic journey was potentially the most important journey I'd ever done because it allowed me to shed that anger and resentment I had and achieve this post traumatic growth, if you like. For a mum, it's transmuting grief into hope. Like when my mum passed away, that was devastating. And going to New Zealand turned what was the worst time in my life into not the best time in my life, but into something that I could make sense of and bring her into my life every day. And that journey was was healing in that way.
You said that not many books, publications really talk about the real aspect of what you go through in life, and it adds to the reason why we travel, why we all travel. There might be reasons why we travel. As I said, reading the book, the entire book, I was hooked on it immediately. And there's a lot of books, as I said to you, there's conventional, and we've talked about, where they talk about the author's journey and not necessarily you dig deep in and look at it in a scientific way. And I really feel as though you've really answered the question of why we travel, and it's a testament to yourself and the research that you've put into it. It's right up there as one of the best books I've read, travel books I've read anyway. But I probably could go as far as saying one of the best books I've read in a long time. So I really applaud you for
Amazing.
that.
Thanks, mate. Well, there's an audio book coming out as well, so if people aren't bored enough of my voice already, they can get that. Thanks. I'm really glad you've enjoyed it. And I think it's not so much that other travel books don't go into personal stuff so much. The book that won the Edward Stanford Travel Writers Award in the year that I judged was a book about a woman climbing Everest to deal with her trauma of abuse as a kid, as it happens. It's the sort of think that was a very personal, that was quite a difficult book to read actually, because some of the descriptions of what she went through. I suppose the difference in my book is it covers it covers my entire life and lots of different journeys. It's not just two experiences hooked together.
That's what the appeal is. So it's not necessarily, 'cause as I said, I'm not saying that the books I've read aren't great. Some of them are fantastic books, by the way, but it added a different element to it. I thought, I'm reading your story, and then you go into reasons why you're doing it, and not every book covers that. And I thought that was really, really, it's a great take on the book, and that really stands out on the shelf. And again, you really try to go back to answer the question why we travel, and that is the reason why I thought the book was fantastic.
Thanks. And I really hope that if people understand why they travel, they will then be able to understand how can we do this better and how can we make it more fulfilling. So it's not just a sort of academic book to leave on the shelf and go, oh, that's interesting. I know why we travel. It is full of tips. At the end of each chapter, pretty much has a bit of an exploration about how you can do this, or within each chapter. It's not even at the end. Like, how do you do eudaimonic tourism more ethically? How do you do hedonism more ethically or more fulfillingly, not just ethically? And I think that is part of what I really wanted to do throughout it, is to give readers ways of thinking and advice that will help them with their own travels.
And do you have plans? The book does well. Let's say when it comes out on the 11th of April, you think, right, I can really go deep into certain chapters a bit more. Is that a plan?
I have no idea. At the moment, I'm just trying to enjoy having written a book. And, like, I don't really have anything left to talk about. I put everything into this book. I think I've tried to make each chapter readable, interesting enough, and informative and useful enough for people to take away from it. If I'd have kept something back for a second book, then I feel I would have done readers a disservice on this book. So I've done everything I can on this book to make it as useful to people as possible. And if I were to ever do a second book, it would have to be something quite different. Maybe something around fatherhood. Who knows?
And who are the target audience for this book? Is it everyone from school kids to even people who are retired?
When I've spoken to people, I've been not surprised, but the diversity of people who are interested in this book, because there are 12 different motivations. It covers lots of different things. So, like chapter 6, hardship, great for people who are interested in ultra marathons, Everest, all that kind of stuff, mountain climbing, that kind of thing. But I did a talk at Oxford University the other week to people who were leaving that year, and they were fascinated. They really wanted to learn more because they were about to leave university and they had set aside some time to travel, and they wanted it to be fulfilling. They wanted to make the most of it. So for them, that was a great book. For people who are that 25 to sort of 40 age bracket, millennials, basically, who have grown up in a world where the chance of them buying a house is pretty limited, or the chance of them having those sorts of things are pretty limited, for whom travel is a really important part of their life. That's where there's no point in them saving for a house. So a lot of money goes on travel. That's a sort of my peer group. For them, how do they think differently about travel? They've been to Ibiza, they've been backpacking around Southeast Asia. how do you travel in a more fulfilling way? And that doesn't necessarily mean going further. I talk a lot about how do you make the most out of the area near where you live, which is something Al Humphreys talks about a lot. And that, I think, offers something else. And then you've got the sort of 65 plus retirees who are either retired or wanting to travel more of the world, or they just want to see more of their home country. And those seem to be the three main groups that are really interested in it, or four. You've kind of got the retirees, 25 to 40, university leavers, maybe school leavers. I've not spoken to any school leavers recently. And then people who are just interested in, like, the sort of almost, like, travel for them is very related to self development. Those sorts of mountaineers and those sorts of hobbies and activities.
Where can people buy this book? I'm assuming it's all good bookstores online. So tell
Yeah.
everyone where everyone can buy the book.
So, Why We Travel: A Journey into Human Motivation by Ash Bhardwaj. The hardback comes out on the 11th of April. Please pre-order. It makes things much better for me because then the bookshops love it. You can pre-order from Amazon, but if you can, go and order it from your local bookshop. Support them. Amazon are great because it promotes it for me better, but I'd much rather everyone's money goes to their local bookshop rather than a tax-dodging billionaire.
Well, Ash Bhardwaj, well, thank you so much for your time today. Fantastic. Again, I applaud you for the amazing book that you've written, and I'm sure I'll speak to you very soon.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ed. Great to speak to you, mate. Enjoy the book. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the bell button to never miss an episode, and watch all my previous episodes from the show. You can also follow me on all my social media platforms. That's it for Take a One Dose Chefs. Hope to see you all soon. Until next time, bye for now.